We've been talking about Israel in their time in the desert. And last week, or 2 weeks ago, we talked about how God gave Israel the Ten Commandments and His law, and what He wanted them to do with that, and how they didn't do a very good job with it, right? And then last week we talked about how God always has a plan, and His plans are organized. They're orderly, and He communicates that plan with us. He tells us what He wants from us. He is very clear. And today, God speaks to us through His Word, doesn't He? And so I've been encouraging you to practice learning the books of the Bible and to be reading your Bible, either by yourself or with your family, okay? But last week we saw a couple of different things about how Israel just wasn't doing a very good job of really trusting God and respecting and honoring God as being in charge of them. And they were griping and complaining about the manna, the food from heaven that God was giving them, and they ate all of those quail that God provided for them. He gave them more than they asked for, and it made them sick because they weren't really supposed to need it in the first place. And then some of the leadership, Miriam and Aaron, started grumbling and complaining, and God punished Miriam and gave her leprosy. But Moses prayed for her, and she was healed after 7 days, remember? So now they're in the desert. They left Egypt, they're in the desert, and they're on their way to the promised land that God promised Abraham way back when he was looking out at the stars, remember? And it's really not that far from Egypt to where they were supposed to be going. I mean, it's far, but not that far, okay? And so they were getting close to getting to the land that God had promised them. And so God told Moses, He said, Moses, here's what I want you to do. I want you to choose one man from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And I want these men to go and spy out the land that I have promised you. And Moses is like, okay, I can do that. So Moses went and he chose one man from each tribe of Israel. And he told them that he wanted them to go up, look at the land, see what kind of food there is there, see what kind of people there are. Are there lots of towns? Does it look like it's strong there, like the people are strong or like they're weak or whatever? Just check it all out and bring us back a report. And so the men left, and they were gone for 40 days. They went around all of the land that God had promised and looked around at the food and the people and the places for 40 days. And when they came back, you know what they brought with them? They brought with them, between two of the men, they were carrying this stick. And behind the stick, and on the stick was a big old clump of grapes. Have you ever do you like grapes? And you know how you can pick up the whole clump and it hangs like this? Yeah? Well, this cluster of grapes was so big that they had to put it on a stick and carry it between two grown men. That's how big this cluster of grapes were. And so when they came back, they got all of the people of Israel together. They got Moses and Aaron together, and they said, okay, we went to the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey. In other words, it has all of the good stuff that God said it was going to have. And this is the fruit that we brought back. Isn't it amazing? Look how big it is. But the people who live there in the land are strong. And the cities are very fortified. They have lots of protection, and they're very large. And the people that live inside these cities are descendants of Anak and Nephthalim, which were giants. And they said, we became grasshoppers in their sight. That's how much bigger than us they were. They were like big, huge giants, and we were like grasshoppers. We're not able to go up and take this land. It's too strong for us. And so they gave Israel a bad report. And the people who were listening to the spies started to cry because they were like, oh my goodness, we've been dreaming of this land for hundreds of years. Our ancestors have been telling us about this land. God delivered us from Egypt, and we thought it was finally time. But why? Why did He have to bring us out of Egypt? Why did He have to bring us here to the wilderness to die? Because we can't go beat these people. We can't do it. And so we're just going to die here in the wilderness. Because if we went into these towns, here's what would happen to us. Our children would be killed. They would fall by the swords. Our wives and our little ones would become plunder. Would it not have been better if we had just returned to Egypt? I know what we should do, people. We should appoint a new leader, and he can take us back to Egypt. So that's what Israel thought. Well, two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, and Moses and Aaron, started to, they just could not believe what their ears were hearing. And they said, no, please don't say this kind of stuff. And Caleb said, the land which we passed through to spy out is exceedingly good. It is good land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into the land and he will give it to us. Only please do not rebel against the Lord. We've already done this before. And do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey if the Lord goes before us. So Caleb was like, you guys need to stop now. And we need to go do this because God has made a promise and he's a promise keeper. But the congregation, all of the people, and the other 10 spies said, nope, we don't want to listen to you. And you know what they said they were going to do? They were going to pick up stones and kill Joshua and Caleb because they were trying to lead them into death. So God got really mad. And he said to Moses, he said, how long? How long do I have to put up with these people? I have delivered them from Egypt with great pestilence and marvelous miracles. And I've brought them here and I've performed things in their midst. I am going to kill them all and start over with you, Moses. He's already said he was going to do this before. And he's getting very angry with Israel because Israel is not learning how to trust God. But Moses again prayed for Israel and he said, God, please don't do that. They're driving me crazy too. But Egypt and all of these nations that we have seen since we left Egypt have heard all of the marvelous things that you have done. And if you kill them all before you bring them into the promised land, here's what's going to happen. Those people are going to say, well, the Lord ended up killing him because he wasn't strong enough to bring them into the promised land. And so he said, God, not because they deserve it, but because of your great name, please forgive them. And so God said, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. I will forgive them for my name's sake. He said, surely, though, there will be punishment. And here's the punishment. All of the men and women who were old enough to have been there in Egypt and to see what I did and to remember it will die in the desert. Not right now, not this day, but they will die in the desert because for every day that the spies went and walked through the promised land, which was 40 days, for every single one of those days, you guys are going to live a year in the desert. So they were going to wander in the desert for 40 years. And it was not that far from Egypt to the promised land, but God was not going to go with them for those 40 years into the promised land. He said, this is punishment. And everybody who's over the age of 20 will die in the desert, except for Caleb and for Joshua, because they believed my promise. And he said, all of those things that you were afraid of were going to happen to you if you went into the promised land, like your wives and your children being killed and all of these things attacking you and happening to you. Those things are going to happen to you in the desert because you didn't believe I could protect you. And so then Israel was like, oh, we're sorry, God, we're sorry. Please forgive us. So we're sorry, we've sinned. And God said, yes, I already forgave you, but this is the punishment. Well, they all went to bed, and the next morning they woke up and they were really feeling sorry for themselves, and they were really feeling bad about what God said was going to happen to them. So you know what they decided? They got a bunch of group of people together and they said, you know what? Maybe we can do this. Let's go fight. And Moses said, no, 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 no. That time has come and gone. You didn't want to go when God wanted you to go. You didn't trust God yesterday. And God said, I'm going to kill you all and start over. But I prayed for you, and God has decided to spare some of you. But those of you who didn't believe, who saw how big God is in Egypt, you can't go into the promised land. Please do not rebel yet again. And they said, no, it's okay. We are sorry. Now we're going to go and do it. And he said, but God's not going to go with you. You're going to be by yourself. They're like, no. Well, they went up and tried to fight the Amalekites by themselves. And many, many of them died that day. And also, God went ahead and sent a disease for the 10 spies who went into the land, who came back and brought a bad report. Because it is not okay to know who God is and to know what God can do and not believe it. If we know who God is, which we do, and we know how powerful Jesus is and God and what he can do, and we know what his Bible says and tells us to do, and we ignore it, God can punish us, and he's going to be right when he does that, isn't he? So here's what I find hard to believe. God promised them this promised land hundreds of years before. They'd been hearing about it for hundreds, and since as long as they'd been born. And they had seen God protect them. They had seen God do miraculous things like separating a Red Sea and feeding them from heaven and defeating enemies just without even weapons. But when God said, okay, it's time to go, they were too afraid. We need to trust God because he's a good, good Father. You remember that song we sing at church sometimes? God is a good Father. And when he tells us something, we can remember he's a promise keeper. And even if we're afraid, even if we're scared, we can trust that he is in control and he is going to take care of us. So we need to be brave and we need to obey so that we can be part of what he's doing rather than be sad with with choosing not to obey God and then living with the consequences of disobeying him. Okay? So just remember how big our God is and how much he has done. Think back about in your life the times that God has protected you and provided you with things that you needed, and the times that he talks to you in his word. Think about those times and remember them. It's important to create memories in your mind that you can look back on the way Israel should have done when we're scared. When I'm scared, I try to remember the times that God has always been there for me. Okay? And it's very important to create this memory book in our head. Okay? Because he's a very, very good and big God. Next week, we're going to see what starts to happen with the Israelites now that they have to live in the desert for 40 years before they can go in to the promised land. I will see you then.